The Valdorian Empire had perfected the art of institutional bullying with the same dedication that lesser civilizations applied to poetry or cuisine. Their philosophy could be summarized in 3 simple words: might makes right. Of course, they dressed it up in considerably more syllables, complete with academic dissertations on hierarchical efficiency through strength-based governance and the natural order of cosmic dominance. But strip away the pretentious terminology, and you had a galaxy-spanning collection of individuals who had never quite outgrown the playground. Their caste system operated on beautifully simple principles. At the top sat those who could atomize a moon with their bare hands or pilot starships through dimensional rifts while composing war poetry. At the bottom languished anyone whose greatest achievement involved something embarrassingly peaceful, like agriculture or healthcare. The middle rungs were occupied by beings who fell somewhere between moderately intimidating and could probably win a bar fight against a particularly aggressive houseplant. This system had served them remarkably well for approximately 3,000 years, during which they had conquered, subjugated, or otherwise persuaded 47 star systems to join their little empire. Their most recent acquisition was the Quillan system, home to traders so peaceful they had surrendered the moment Valdorian ships appeared on their sensors. Not after negotiations failed, not after a token resistance, but literally the moment the first blip showed up on their screens. The Valdorians found this simultaneously convenient and deeply contemptible. Commander Zephyk of the Valdorian Third Fleet represented the Empire's middle management at its finest. Too competent to ignore, too lacking in imagination to promote, he had been assigned the gloriously mundane task of administrating their newest acquisition. The Quillan, bless their terrified hearts, had proven to be model subjects. They paid their tribute on time, followed regulations to the letter, and asked permission before breathing too loudly. Zephyk found their compliance almost insulting. Where was the fun in ruling people who actually wanted to be ruled? The trading station orbiting Quillan Prime buzzed with the sort of nervous efficiency that characterized most imperial holdings. Vendors hawked their wares with one eye on their customers and another on the Valdorian patrols. Dockworkers moved cargo with the urgent care of beings who understood that a single dropped container might result in a public flogging. It was, by Valdorian standards, a perfectly ordered society, which made the arrival of the human vessel wandering optimist something of a cosmic punchline. Captain Marcus Chen had been trading these routes for 15 years, long enough to develop what his crew charitably called an appreciation for bureaucratic nuance. Others might have used less charitable terms, such as an unhealthy obsession with filing procedures or the ability to weaponize paperwork. His ship carried a modest cargo of rare minerals and agricultural products, the sort of goods that kept interstellar commerce humming along without attracting undue attention. The Valdorians, naturally, had never heard of humans. They were newcomers to this sector. Their homeworld, located in a spiral arm so unfashionable that most galactic maps labeled it "Here be boring planets." Their entry into galactic society had been typically understated. No dramatic first contact, no bold declarations of independence, just a gradual accumulation of trading licenses and customs declarations, until suddenly they were everywhere, selling everything from exotic spices to quantum processors with the same cheerful efficiency. Commander Zephyk reviewed the manifest with the sort of bored professionalism that came from processing dozens of similar requests each day. Humans. Never heard of them. Their ship registered as civilian class, minimal armaments, crew of 12. In other words, completely irrelevant. He assigned them Docking Bay 7 and promptly forgot they existed. The Quillan, meanwhile, had assembled for their weekly efficiency evaluation a delightful Valdorian innovation that combined performance reviews with public humiliation. These sessions served multiple purposes. They reminded the locals of their place in the cosmic hierarchy, provided entertainment for bored garrison troops, and generated paperwork that justified the administrative budget. Everyone won, assuming your definition of winning included systematic degradation of sentient dignity. The evaluations took place in the station's main commerce deck, where Valdorian officials had erected a small platform decorated with imperial banners and intimidating weaponry. Today's participants included 17 Quillen merchants, 3 agricultural coordinators, and 1 unfortunate sanitation engineer who had been selected at random. They stood in neat rows, their natural blue-green skin having shifted to a pale yellow that indicated extreme nervousness. Zefik took his position behind a podium, equipped with a holographic display showing each participant's performance metrics. The numbers meant absolutely nothing, of course, but they provided a veneer of objectivity to what was essentially institutionalized harassment. He cleared his throat and began the ritual. "Citizens of the Quillen system," he announced, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had practiced this speech many times. "Today we evaluate your continued worthiness to participate in the glory of the Valdorian Empire." The humans had arrived during the opening ceremony and taken seats at a nearby cafe, ostensibly to enjoy refreshments while their cargo was processed. Captain Chen sipped something that approximated coffee, while his crew chatted quietly among themselves. To the casual observer, they appeared to be tourists taking in the local culture. Zefik noticed them peripherally but dismissed them as irrelevant backdrop. The first Quillen merchant, an elderly trader named Vexith, stepped forward for evaluation. His crime was failing to meet an arbitrarily adjusted quota for exotic fruit exports. The penalty involved public recitation of imperial regulations while standing on one foot. It was petty, humiliating, and entirely legal under the broad powers granted to system administrators. Vexith began his recitation, swaying slightly as he struggled to maintain balance. The gathered Valdorians chuckled appreciatively. The watching Quillen maintained careful neutral expressions, and Captain Chen quietly activated a small recording device while reviewing something on a handheld tablet. The evaluations continued for nearly an hour, each more creative than the last. A young Quillen named Thys was required to explain why his atmospheric processing facility had exceeded efficiency standards by 2%. The sanitation engineer received a formal reprimand for cleaning waste recycling systems too thoroughly. An agricultural coordinator faced questioning about suspicious levels of crop yield optimization. It was during Thys's interrogation that Captain Chen made his first move. "Excuse me," he said, approaching the platform with the polite diffidence of someone asking for directions. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but I have a question about docking procedures." Zefik paused mid-sentence, irritation flashing across his reptilian features. "This is an official administrative proceeding. Your questions will be addressed during normal business hours." "Oh, I understand completely," Chen replied, consulting his tablet. "It's just that I'm seeing some discrepancies in the documentation, and I wanted to make sure we're in compliance with Imperial Trade Regulation 847C regarding witness requirements for administrative hearings." The commander's irritation deepened. "What are you talking about?" Chen held up his tablet, displaying what appeared to be an official Imperial document. "Well, according to subsection 12, any administrative action that might affect trade status requires proper documentation and witness verification. I've been recording this proceeding for our standard compliance reports, but I noticed you haven't filed the appropriate notification forms." Zefik stared at him, processing this information with the speed of someone who had never actually read the regulations he was supposed to enforce. That's that regulation doesn't apply to efficiency evaluations. Are you certain? Chen asked mildly. Because I show here that any proceeding which might result in changes to a citizen's trade status or economic standing falls under commercial oversight protocols. And some of these evaluations seem to be affecting vendor licenses and cargo handling permits. A murmur ran through the assembled Quillen as they began to understand what was happening. Zephyr felt the first stirrings of actual concern, the sort that came from realizing you might have overlooked something important. I don't see how that's relevant, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Chen smiled, the sort of smile that customer service representatives practiced in mirrors. Oh, I'm sure you're absolutely right. It's just that my trading license requires me to report any irregularities in commercial oversight to the Imperial Trade Commission. Would you mind if I transmitted a query to verify the proper procedures? The beauty of bureaucratic warfare lay in its complete passivity. Chen wasn't threatening anyone, wasn't challenging imperial authority, wasn't even raising his voice. He was simply asking questions and following procedures, the sort of mind-numbingly proper behavior that the Empire officially encouraged in all its citizens. Zephyr found himself trapped in the nightmare scenario of middle management everywhere being held accountable for rules he didn't actually understand. His training had covered intimidation, suppression, and the efficient processing of tribute payments. Nobody had bothered to mention that some citizens might actually read the fine print. The efficiency evaluations are conducted under my administrative authority, he said, hoping confidence might substitute for knowledge. Absolutely, Chen agreed. And I'm sure your authority is completely proper. I'm just trying to understand the documentation requirements. For instance, I see that several of these citizens are having their trading permits modified based on these evaluations. That's definitely a commercial action, which means it falls under trade regulation oversight, which requires... He consulted his tablet again. Oh dear, quite a lot of paperwork actually. The human's crew had begun drifting closer, apparently drawn by curiosity. Chen's first officer, a woman named Rebecca Torres, produced her own tablet and began cross-referencing regulations with the enthusiasm of someone who genuinely enjoyed administrative complexity. Captain, she said, I'm showing that procedural violations in trade oversight can result in suspension of system-wide commercial licenses pending investigation. Chen nodded gravely. That could seriously impact shipping schedules. Commander, would it be possible to postpone these evaluations until we can verify the proper procedures? I'd hate for there to be any complications with our cargo manifest. Zephyr felt the conversation slipping away from him like a ship with a failed navigation system. The Quillen were listening with growing interest, no longer maintaining their careful neutral expressions. His own troops looked confused, unsure whether they were witnessing an administrative discussion or some form of elaborate rebellion. These are standard imperial procedures, he insisted. I'm sure they are, Chen said soothingly. But standards do evolve. For instance, this memo from the Imperial Trade Commission updates several protocols regarding colonial administration, dated just last month. Have you received the updated guidance? He hadn't, of course. System commanders received dozens of administrative updates each week, most of which were ignored in favor of more interesting matters like weapon maintenance and intimidation schedules. Chen held out his tablet, displaying what appeared to be an official communication complete with imperial seals and bureaucratic jargon. The memo was entirely legitimate, obtained through proper channels during the Wandering Optimist's previous stop at an imperial trade hub. It dealt with procedural updates regarding commercial oversight in newly integrated systems, the sort of mind-numbing regulatory revision that usually went straight into digital waste disposal. Chen had read every word. This section here, he said, pointing to a paragraph dense with subclauses and cross-references, clarifies the relationship between administrative efficiency evaluations and commercial licensing procedures. It appears that any evaluation which might affect a citizen's economic status must be conducted according to trade regulation protocols, with proper notice periods and appeal procedures. Zefik scanned the document, his reptilian eyes struggling to pass the dense bureaucratic language. The words seemed to writhe on the screen, forming and reforming into increasingly threatening configurations. Administrative protocol, due process requirements, commercial oversight jurisdiction, appeal procedures. This doesn't change anything, he said, but his voice carried the hollow ring of someone trying to convince himself. "Oh, I hope not," Chen replied. "It's just that I'm required to report procedural irregularities to the Trade Commission, and irregular procedures can trigger investigations, and investigations can result in trade sanctions, and sanctions can affect our shipping schedules," and he trailed off, allowing the implications to settle in the air like particularly ominous clouds. The genius of the approach lay in its complete legitimacy. Chen wasn't threatening anyone or challenging imperial authority. He was simply a concerned citizen trying to ensure proper compliance with regulations. Regulations that, it turned out, the Empire's local administrators didn't actually understand. Rebecca Torres chose that moment to look up from her own research. "Captain, I'm also seeing some issues with jurisdiction here. It appears that trade-related administrative actions in newly integrated systems require oversight from the Colonial Integration Office, not local military commanders." Chen nodded thoughtfully. "That's interesting. Commander, do you have authorization from the Colonial Integration Office for these proceedings?" Zefik stared at him, processing this question with the growing realization that he was drowning in an ocean of bureaucratic complexity that he had never bothered to learn how to navigate. His authority came from his position in the military hierarchy, not from any understanding of the labyrinthine regulations that theoretically governed his actions. "I have full administrative authority over this system," he said, but the words sounded increasingly hollow. "I'm sure you do," Chen agreed. "But administrative authority and trade oversight authority are different jurisdictions, like the difference between military command and civilian law enforcement. Both are important, but they have different procedures and requirements." The Quillen were beginning to understand the magnificent complexity of what they were witnessing. For 3 months they had submitted to humiliating efficiency evaluations, assuming they had no choice in the matter. Now they were learning that the entire process might be procedurally invalid, conducted by officials who lacked proper jurisdiction and following protocols that violated trade regulations. Young Thys, still standing on the platform where his interrogation had been interrupted, cleared his throat nervously. "Excuse me, but does this mean the efficiency evaluations aren't legally required?" Chen turned to him with the sort of helpful expression that customer service representatives reserved for their favorite customers. "Well, that depends on proper jurisdiction and documentation. If the evaluations are being conducted under Trade Regulation Authority, then they require certain procedures and safeguards. If they're being conducted under military authority, then they're subject to different protocols, but they can't be both." Zefik felt the bureaucratic walls closing in around him. The beautiful simplicity of might makes right was crumbling under the weight of actually existing regulations that he had never bothered to read. His training had prepared him for rebellion, resistance, and various forms of civil disobedience. Nobody had warned him about compliance warfare. "I need to consult with my superiors," he said finally. Chen nodded sympathetically. "That's probably wise. In the meantime, would it be appropriate to suspend the efficiency evaluations pending clarification of jurisdiction and procedures, just to avoid any potential complications? The commander wanted to refuse, wanted to reassert his authority and continue with the proceedings. But he found himself trapped by the Empire's own bureaucratic complexity. If he proceeded without proper authorization, he risked facing administrative sanctions himself. If he suspended the proceedings, he appeared weak in front of his troops and the local population. It was, from Chen's perspective, a perfectly designed no-win scenario. The evaluations are suspended pending administrative review, Zefik announced, his voice carrying all the enthusiasm of someone scheduling their own execution. The Quillen began filing out of the assembly area, their body language transformed from fearful compliance to cautious optimism. Several of them nodded respectfully to Chen as they passed, a gesture that did not go unnoticed by the watching Valdorians. Chen and his crew returned to their table at the cafe, where they resumed their beverages and casual conversation as if nothing had happened. But the damage was done. Word would spread throughout the station that the mighty Valdorian Empire could be challenged, not through violence or rebellion, but through the devastating power of proper paperwork. Zefik retreated to his office to compose what would undoubtedly be the most humiliating report of his military career. He would have to explain how a single human trader had effectively paralyzed imperial administration through the simple expedient of actually reading the regulations. His superiors would demand explanations he didn't have and solutions he couldn't provide. The Quillen, meanwhile, began their own research into imperial trade regulations, colonial integration office procedures, and administrative oversight protocols. They discovered a fascinating world of bureaucratic complexity that could be turned against their oppressors with surgical precision. Forms that required filing, procedures that demanded following, appeal processes that guaranteed consideration. Captain Chen completed his business on the station and prepared to depart, leaving behind a transformed situation. The weekly efficiency evaluations never resumed, suspended indefinitely pending review by authorities who were too embarrassed to admit they didn't understand their own regulations. As the wandering optimist pulled away from the station, Chen filed his routine compliance report with the Imperial Trade Commission, noting several procedural irregularities that required attention. The report would trigger an investigation, which would uncover systematic violations of trade regulations, which would result in administrative sanctions against local commanders. The empire that had built its power on the simple principle that might makes right discovered something fascinating about the galaxy they claimed to rule. Sometimes the mightiest weapon is a properly completed form filed in triplicate with the appropriate oversight authority. And in the end, the Valdorians learned that there are many different kinds of strength, and theirs wasn't nearly as impressive as they'd thought.